They said his skin glowed under moonlight, pale as frost, eyes red as burning coals. On nights when the wind carried screams through the cane fields, no one dared step outside. They whispered one name, Devil's White, and by dawn, another. Overseer was found, peeled open like judgment itself. In 1831, on a remote plantation near Savannah, a child was born under a blood-red moon. His mother, a slave named Ada, screamed for 3 days, not from pain, but from terror. The baby's skin was white as salt, his eyes pink, his hair the color of snow. The other slaves crossed themselves. The mistress fainted. The master, Colonel Abram Thorne, spat on the ground and said, "The devil breeds strange livestock." The child's condition, albinism, was unknown to them. But superstition moved faster than reason. He was called the Cursed One, Ghost-born, and finally, Devil's White. He grew up in isolation, watched by fearful eyes and guarded by cruelty. The overseers used him as an example, a living punishment. By age 10, he'd already learned silence as survival. When he was beaten, he didn't cry. When they whispered prayers against him, he stood still as marble. Ada tried to shield him, but the others warned her. "He ain't yours anymore. He belongs to something else." And then came the first sign, the night the barn caught fire. The overseer who whipped him was found the next morning with burns that didn't kill but revealed every layer of skin. The colonel called it an accident. But the slaves whispered that Devil's White had smiled when the fire began. Years passed. His body grew tall and lean, his skin untouched by sun, his silence turning into something colder. Overseers rotated often on Thorne's land. None lasted long. They said he watched them work with eyes that saw too much. By 1853, 9 overseers had come and gone, each leaving behind whispers, blood, and a single phrase carved in wood. 9 for the one they burned. If you lived on that plantation, would you have stayed or run before nightfall? Mini cliffhanger. The next section reveals the massacre that made his name a curse. By the spring of 1853, the Thorne plantation had already earned a quiet infamy. Overseers arrived like vultures, armed with new rules, new chains, new rage, and left in pine boxes. Still, the colonel hired another, a brute named Jeremiah Cole, whose cruelty was as methodical as prayer. Cole had a habit of counting each lash aloud. He believed fear was most effective when measured. 9 for disobedience, he'd sneer, dragging the whip's tip along a slave's back like a brush dipped in oil. But there was one he couldn't break, the pale one who never screamed. Devil's White had grown into a figure of eerie grace. His hair shimmered silver under sunlight, his veins visible through his thin, colorless skin. He spoke little, obeyed every order, but watched everything. To Cole, that quiet was mockery. "You think your ghost blood makes you special?" He spat one day. "Let's see if it bleeds the same." That night, Cole ordered him tied to the whipping post. The others stood in a half circle, their faces hidden behind trembling hands. The air was heavy, humid and metallic, as the whip cracked through the silence. Once, twice. The sound echoed like thunder off dry wood. On the 9th strike, lightning flashed across the horizon. Cole raised his arm for the 10th, but paused. The slave was looking at him, directly, unblinking. In that instant, something ancient passed between them, not hatred, but recognition. Cole dropped the whip. His hands were shaking. "What in God's—" Before dawn, the plantation. Dogs began howling. The colonel woke to shouting, the kind that only comes from seeing what the human mind shouldn't. Cole was found hanging from the cotton press beam, stripped bare, his skin peeled in long, clean ribbons from shoulder to heel. The overseer's mouth was stuffed with the whip he'd used. His eyes were open, reflecting the first pale light of morning. Beside him, carved deep into the blood-soaked wood, were 9 small tally marks. Nothing else. The colonel ordered silence. "This is God's punishment for weakness," he told the others. "There'll be no talk of ghosts or devils." But fear has no master. That night, no one sang, no one prayed. The field stood empty, the quarters locked tight. And yet, from the smokehouse, someone saw him. The pale man, standing by the hanging post, looking up at the dawn, the wind lifting his white hair. They said the blood on his hands wasn't his. Tell me in the comments, do you believe it was vengeance, or something far darker? Colonel Abram Thorne had ruled his land for 30 years with the same cold precision he used in war. His word was law, his anger, gospel. Yet after Jeremiah Cole's body was found, even Thorne's voice faltered. For the first time, authority met something it could not command. He ordered the corpse burned before sundown. "The devil lives in the skin," he said, his pipe trembling as he spoke. The slaves were forced to gather and watch as Cole's remains turned to ash. The smell was unbearable, sweet, fatty, metallic. But when the flames died, the whip in Cole's mouth remained untouched, blackened but unburned. Thorne ordered it buried, though some swore it was later seen hanging from the barn rafters. That night, Thorne sat alone in his study, the shutters closed, his brandy untouched. The plantation was silent except for the creaking of wood, the sound of a house remembering something it wanted to forget. His wife Eleanor entered quietly. "You've stirred something, Abram," she whispered. "You can't keep punishing the same blood and expect it not to fight back." He didn't respond. He stared at the ledger on his desk, a neat column of names, weights, and ages. Beneath one entry, he'd scrawled a word himself. White. No number beside it. No value. Outside, the slaves prayed in hushed tones. They left small offerings at the edge of the cane fields. Pieces of bread, coins, a child's carved figure. Anything to keep him satisfied. "If we feed the spirit, maybe he won't feed on us," one old woman whispered. By morning, the offerings were gone. Then came the sound, soft at first, like leather dragged across earth. The field hands followed it to the old smokehouse. The door swung open on its own, revealing only darkness within. And at the center of the floor, carved deep into the packed dirt, were 9 symbols, each drawn in blood. Thorne summoned Reverend R. Whitfield from Savannah to bless the land. The Reverend arrived with incense, holy water, and a trembling hand. But when he sprinkled the threshold, the wind blew the water back into his face. "Some places," he muttered, "don't want God here." That night, Thorne awoke to footsteps in the hall, bare, slow, deliberate. He called out. No answer. He opened the door, lantern in hand. The footprints led away from his room, down toward the fields, and at their end, pressed into the soft Georgia mud, was the faint shape of a hand, pale, human, and freshly made. Would you have stayed in that house another night, or fled before the dawn? The cane fields swayed that week without wind. Workers said the stalks moved on their own, whispering in voices too soft to name. The old ones refused to go near them after sundown, claiming the fields had begun to breathe. "He's down there," one woman whispered, clutching a rosary she'd carved from bone. "The pale one walks between the roots." Colonel Thorne dismissed it all. "Fear breeds laziness," he said. "Fear needs a lash." But he didn't step into those fields himself anymore. His eyes had grown hollow, ringed by sleepless nights, his temper frayed to the edge. One morning, a young field hand named Isaac vanished. The others found his tools by the irrigation ditch. Handle cracked clean in two, the metal rusted red overnight. They searched for hours, shouting his name through the cane until one man tripped over something half buried in the soil. It was Isaac's hat, and beneath it, the skin of a man's face peeled away in one perfect piece. The colonel ordered every man to his knees, demanding confessions. No one spoke, but somewhere deep in the field, they heard it, a slow, rhythmic sound, not quite footsteps, not quite dragging. It was the sound of something pulling through, the cane moving closer. When the patrol dogs were sent, they didn't return. Their howls were cut short, swallowed by the tall grass. The only one who dared step forward was Ruthie, the house servant. She said she'd seen him, standing at the edge of the moonlight, barefoot, head tilted. His eyes caught the reflection of the lanterns, burning red like coals. Ruthie said, "He didn't move, didn't breathe. He only raised his hand, the skin stretched, raw, bloodless, and pointed toward the big house." That night, thunder rolled, but no rain came. The air was heavy, smelling of rust and cane sugar. From the second-floor balcony, the colonel watched the fields ripple like black water. He thought he saw a figure walking through it, tall, pale, and glowing faintly, like bone beneath skin. When morning came, another overseer was gone. His boots were found hanging on the fence, filled with something wet. The slaves stopped speaking his name. They called him the Whisper in the Cane, the ghost of their vengeance, but some still prayed for him, believing he wasn't a monster. Just the price of their silence made flesh. If you heard those whispers under your window, would you pray or run? By midsummer, the thorn plantation was dying from the inside out. The crops stood tall, but the men who worked them trembled, like reeds in a storm. The colonel imported new overseers from Alabama, hard men, desperate men, promising double pay if they could restore order. None asked about the 9 who'd come before. On their first night, they drank together in the mess hall, laughing too loudly, pretending not to notice the silence outside. The table groaned with food, roasted pork, biscuits, bourbon, but no one ate much. Every creak of the house made their hands twitch toward their pistols. "Old slave tales," one of them scoffed, chewing slowly. "A ghost can't flay a man." "Then what hung Cole?" another asked. "What peeled him like a hog and left him breathing long enough to pray?" The laughter stopped. Outside, the wind began to rise, dragging a low, rhythmic hum through the fields, the sound of the slaves singing. It wasn't a hymn this time. It was something older, darker, the kind of song that makes even the righteous shiver. The youngest, overseer, Amos, stood to close the shutters. That's when he saw it, a pale shape beyond the glass, standing at the tree line. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Amos stumbled back. "Someone's out there," he hissed. The others rose, weapons ready, hearts pounding. They burst out into the night, lanterns swinging, the wet earth sucking at their boots. The field was silent now. No wind, no voices, only the faint sound of breathing, not theirs. Then the lanterns flickered out, one by one. The first scream came from behind them. By the time the light returned, one man was gone, his lantern smashed, the soil around it slick and dark. They fled to the barn. Inside, the smell hit them. Copper, salt, decay. Hanging from the rafters were strips of flesh, perfectly tanned, like hide still dripping. Someone had turned the barn into a butcher's workshop. On the floor, burned into the wood, were 9 marks again. Always 9. Amos turned to run, but the door slammed shut. From the rafters above, something shifted, a faint creak, then the slow descent of a body swaying by its ankles. It wasn't fresh, it wasn't old, it was pale as wax. When the door finally burst open at dawn, the barn was empty. Only the table remained, and on it, 9 empty plates. Would you have entered that barn, knowing one seat was still warm? By late August, the cane fields glowed ghost white under the heat, their green stripped by drought and ash. Locals said it was the soil turning against the living. Colonel Thorne blamed blight, ordered fresh planting, and forbade the slaves from speaking of curses. But the land itself had stopped obeying him. No birds nested in the rafters anymore. No frogs sang by the creek. Even the insects seemed to vanish when dusk came. What remained was silence and the smell. It was faint at first, like sour milk and iron, but by morning it thickened into something unbearable. The colonel rode out with his foreman to find the source. At the far edge of the property, the cane parted into a clearing he'd never seen before. The ground was pale, unnaturally so, covered in a fine powder that shimmered like frost. The horses refused to move closer. The colonel dismounted and crouched down. The powder wasn't dust, it was skin. Hundreds of tiny flakes, like something shed over time. In the center of the clearing stood 9 poles driven deep into the ground, each crowned with something wrapped in burlap. When the wind blew, the Fabric shifted, and for a moment he saw what was underneath, eyes empty and dry. He staggered back, muttering, "No man did this." But the foreman wasn't looking at the poles. His gaze was fixed lower, at the soil. From beneath it, something pale pushed upward, as though the ground itself was giving birth. It was a hand, long fingers, no nails, white as bone. They fled back to the house, neither speaking of what they'd seen. That night, the colonel ordered, every window sealed, every candle lit. But light only casts more shadows, and they soon realized someone had already been inside. On the dining table lay fresh cane stalks, arranged neatly in a bundle. Between them, something glistened. Strips of skin, still wet. Eleanor fainted at the sight. Thorne just stared, his face pale and rigid. The whip he'd buried months ago was now coiled neatly beside the offering. Ruthie whispered, trembling, "He's taking back the harvest you stole." The colonel slammed his fist down. "I made this land. He was born of my field, my blood. He'll not take it from me." But outside, the wind rose again, carrying that same old song. And beneath it, another sound began to grow. The slow, steady rhythm of a blade dragging through cane. If your crops began to bleed, would you still call it a harvest? By September, the plantation was no longer a place of work. It was a grave that still pretended to live. The colonel stopped holding services, stopped calling for sermons. He locked himself in his study, shutters drawn tight, a revolver always within reach. The ledger still lay on his desk, but where names once filled the page, only one word remained written over and over: White. He hadn't slept in days. The walls creaked with voices he couldn't silence. Sometimes he heard Ada's scream, the one from the night she gave birth to that pale child. Other times he heard Cole's wet gasping. But most nights he heard something worse, the sound of breathing that didn't belong to anyone alive. Ruthie tried to bring him food, but he refused to eat. "He's not after the body," the colonel whispered through the door. "He wants what I built, the order, the obedience. He's tearing it down, piece by piece." Eleanor begged him to leave. "Sell the land, Abram. Go north before this place swallows you whole." He struck the table so hard the glass shattered. "This land is me!" he shouted. Every life that bled for it, every lash, every scream, all of it feeds the soil, and the soil remembers. That night, the Reverend returned, pale and shaking. "I saw him on the road," he confessed, walking toward the house. "The pale man. He doesn't cast a shadow." The colonel rose, hand trembling around his gun. "Then I'll end it tonight." He went to the fields alone. The moon was high, white and cruel. The cane parted for him as he walked, as though the earth itself was making a path. At the clearing, the 9 poles still stood. Beneath them, a single figure waited, still as marble. Devil's white. The colonel raised his pistol. "You're no son of mine." The pale man didn't speak, didn't move. He only tilted his head, and the colonel saw it. The faint scar above his lip, the one he'd given him as a child for speaking out of turn. The colonel hesitated, then the voice came, not from the figure, but from the ground beneath him. 9 for 1. The debt isn't yours to end." The colonel fired. The shot echoed through the fields. By morning, Ruthie found him kneeling in the cane, gun still smoking, eyes open and blank. The bullet had gone through his own skull. Behind him, written in the dirt with something wet, were 9 perfect words: "He only kills what refuses to remember." If you found that message, would you dare read it aloud? Eleanor stopped praying the day her husband died. The colonel's funeral was quiet, attended only by Ruthie and 2 field hands too frightened to refuse. His body was buried without sermon, without stone, just a mound of red clay near the cane that had fed his fortune. The Reverend refused to come. He said the land itself had turned heretic. After that, Eleanor began to wander the halls at night, barefoot, hair unbound, murmuring to herself, The servants whispered that she talked to someone, a pale man in the dark who never answered back. They said she set a plate for him at supper, though no one ever saw him eat. By October, she had dismissed half the staff. "They stare at me," she told Ruthie. "They don't understand he's still my son." "Ma'am," Ruthie whispered, "that thing in the fields ain't no man. You saw what he did." Eleanor's eyes flickered with madness and sorrow. A mother doesn't stop seeing her child just because the world calls him a monster. That night, thunder rolled through the Georgia sky, shaking the shutters loose. The house moaned as if the beams themselves were tired of standing. Eleanor sat in the parlor, candlelight trembling across her face. In her hands lay a bundle of letters, the ones the colonel had written during his years at war, sealed with the family crest. She tore one open, reading it aloud. "My dearest Eleanor, if our child is born pale, burn this letter. It will mean the curse found us." Her breath caught. She read another, then another. By the fifth, her voice was shaking. The colonel had known. He'd known what she carried in her womb and what it would bring. The front door creaked open. Wind swept through the hall, snuffing out every candle but one. Eleanor rose slowly. "My son," she whispered, "you came home." A figure stepped through the doorway, skin white as ash, eyes like moonlit water. His clothes were torn, dried blood along his arms. He didn't speak. Eleanor reached out, tears glistening. "You've suffered enough." He tilted his head, expression unreadable. Then he raised a hand and touched her cheek. The cold was unbearable, the kind that burned. Ruthie found her the next morning, sitting upright in the parlor chair, eyes wide open, lips blue. The single candle had melted down to nothing. On the wall behind her, drawn in soot, were 9 black handprints, and above them, a single word scrawled in uneven script, "Mother." By dawn, the plantation was silent again. Smoke curled faintly from the chimneys, and mist hung low across the fields. Ruthie walked barefoot through the dew, clutching a lantern that barely pushed back the fog. The world felt wrong, too still, too aware. She could feel eyes in the tree line, watching. Behind the main house, near the slave quarters, she found them. 9 fresh mounds of earth, each grave marked with a single wooden cross, carved hastily and driven deep into the ground. No one had buried those men. Not with shovels, not with ceremony. The soil was torn up, clawed from within, as if the ground itself had swallowed them alive. She counted them, 9. The overseers who'd vanished one by one since the night of the colonel's death. The sight made her stomach twist. Some of the crosses were splattered with blood that hadn't yet dried. Others had initials carved crudely into them. Initials Ruthie recognized, men who'd once beaten, branded, and broken others for the colonel's favor. As she knelt beside the last mound, she noticed something buried halfway beneath the dirt. A strip of torn leather, stained black, attached to what looked like skin. She recoiled, dropping her lantern. The flame hissed out in the wet grass. From somewhere beyond the trees, a whisper carried on the wind. "They called me Devil's White." Ruthie froze. The voice was faint, but close enough to chill her spine. She turned slowly, scanning the fog. "Who's there?" Silence, then movement, branches shifting, slow, deliberate. She ran. Through the fields, through the rows of cane that scraped her arms raw. She didn't stop until she reached the church on the edge of town. The doors were locked. She pounded until her fists bled. Inside, Reverend Goodwin sat by the altar, eyes hollow, hands trembling. He had been waiting. "You saw them, didn't you?" he said softly. Ruthie nodded. 9 graves. He did it. He's still out there. The Reverend stared at the crucifix. "I told the colonel, you don't brand a child of God and expect heaven to look away. That boy was born under an eclipse. He was marked from the start." Ruthie shook her head. "No, Reverend. Ain't no devil did this. This was pain. All the pain they gave him, coming back." The old man closed his eyes. "Pain becomes a god when you worship it long enough." Outside, thunder rumbled again, but this time it didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy, coming closer. The Reverend whispered, "He's not done yet." The storm broke that night, not with rain but with fire. From miles away, the sky above the plantation glowed a deep, pulsing red, as if the earth itself had opened its veins. The cane fields burned in long, perfect lines, fire moving like soldiers in formation, precise and merciless. Townsfolk gathered on the ridge, watching in silence. No one dared move closer. Ruthie stood at the edge of the road, wind whipping her dress, tears stinging her eyes. Every crack of burning stalks sounded like a scream. She could hear horses crying in their stables, the faint clang of chains snapping one by one. The scent of scorched molasses and blood filled the night. Some swore they saw a figure walking through the flames, pale, bare-chested, and unburning. "The devil's white," they whispered. His hair glowed silver in the firelight, his eyes like glass. He walked with calm precision, dragging something. Behind him, a long strip of leather that shimmered wet in the glow. No one knew where the colonel's records were kept. But by morning, every ledger, every deed, every paper that proved the ownership of a single soul had turned to ash. The plantation, its cruelty, its wealth, its history, erased in one night. And yet, amid the destruction, one thing remained, untouched: the 9 graves. When dawn came, the fire had consumed everything except that patch of ground. The soil around it was damp, unburned, and cold to the touch. Even the crosses still stood straight, untouched by smoke. Ruthie, shaking, approached the Reverend. "It's over, ain't it?" The old man looked toward the horizon. "No, child. Vengeance don't end with fire. It waits till there's nothing left to burn." Later that day, soldiers rode in from Savannah. The townsmen spoke of rebellion, of revenge, of something that defied human law. But when they entered the ruins, not a body was found, not the colonel's, not the overseer's, not the pale man's, only the fields, silent, blackened, steaming under the noon sun. By nightfall, a heavy mist rolled in again. The air thickened, humming with heat and memory. Ruthie sat by the church window, candle trembling in her hand. She thought of the whisper in the fog, the voice that called her name from nowhere. "If he burned them for what they did," she whispered. "What happens to those who just watched?" The candle flickered once, then it went out. Outside, in the distance, someone was humming, slow, mournful, and terribly familiar. The tune was the same the colonel's slaves had sung in the fields, only now it carried a new name in its chorus: "Devil's White, Devil's White." Years passed. The plantation became nothing more than ruins swallowed by vine and silence. Children were warned not to wander near it. Travelers from Savannah to Augusta swore that when the fog settled heavy, they could see a figure moving through the charred cane fields, tall, pale, and barefoot, humming that same slow, mournful tune. By 1860, the land was sold and renamed, but no one stayed long. Workers vanished. Livestock refused to graze near the tree line. One preacher who tried to bless the grounds went blind within a month. He claimed it wasn't from illness, but from seeing the face of wrath itself. Locals began calling the place Devil's Acre, not for who owned it, but for who refused to leave. One evening, a Union patrol rode through during the war. They reported seeing light flicker from the main house, though everyone knew the house had burned years before. When they approached, they found 9 wooden crosses arranged in a perfect circle. Inside it, a pale figure knelt in the dirt, whispering scripture backward. When the soldiers returned to town, one of them had no skin left on his hands. "He touched me," he muttered again and again, eyes wide with terror. "Cold as stone, cold as judgment." Ruthie lived long enough to tell her story, though no one believed her. In her final years, she kept a small mirror covered with cloth. She said it wasn't her reflection she feared. It was his. "He stands behind me when I speak his name," she once told the Reverend's son, "not to haunt me, but to listen." When she died, they buried her near the church, facing the burned fields. The night after her funeral, Thunder rolled, without rain, and a white mist crept down from the hills, curling over her grave like smoke. Some say vengeance became something holy that night. Others say hell simply claimed what heaven refused. Even now, the locals whisper, on the anniversary of the fire, the cane regrows overnight, tall, silver-white, shining like bone in the moonlight. And if you walk through it, barefoot and unafraid, you might hear the faint hum of a song older than memory. Devil's white, devil's white. Tell me in the comments, do you believe he was born of darkness? Or did the darkness learn to speak through him? Because in Georgia, they still say the fire never really went out. It just waits beneath the soil for the next name worth burning.